let us say,
Amen.
Eloheinu v'Elohei our God and God of our ancestors, watch over the soldiers, the sailors, and the diplomats of the United States of America and of the State of Israel as they go about their tasks far from their homes. May they fulfill their duties honorably, and may they come home to their families and to their places of residence and be able to live in peace. And on these high holy days, our God, God of our ancestors, we ask you to protect, feed, clothe, and house all of those who have been affected by the forces of nature on this continent, in Central America, and all over the world. We also have in our minds and hearts particularly the 400,000 Muslims of the state of Miramar who have in the last week been driven from their homes and massacred in a genocide which is probably the largest since the Holocaust itself. We ask you to remember, God, that when we say never again, we don't just mean never again for us, but we mean never again for anyone. May we have the strength to fulfill your will and your wishes, O God, and to carry forth in such a way as to we help repair the world with your support, with your blessings, and mostly, O God, with your love. Page 154.
Yehalalu Hashem Adonai, Iska Shemo Levado, Hodo al Eretz v'shamayim, vayarem kerem la'amo, tehila le'o hasida, livnei Yisrael ha'geroto. Hallelujah, hallelujah. It's Chaim hi, Chachazikir ba, Beton hea, Bemushar, Verafeha, Darfegoa, Beton tibotea, Shalom. Hashivenu Adonai, Elecha Nashuva, Kadesh, Kadesh Yameinu, Kadesh Yameinu,
Please be seated. The year that we ended last evening was a particularly significant year in Jewish history. I am sure that you all took notice of the fact that last June, Elon died, or as it's printed in English, Day, a 25-year-old Israeli from near Tel Aviv, became the first Israeli, not the first Jew, but the first Israeli to drive in a NASCAR race. He began at the 32nd pole position, and he finished at the 32nd pole position. Which is the way of saying it could have been vice. He was the Israeli Athlete of the Year in 2016, although many of you may not have noticed that. And Alon didn't pop up out of nowhere. He's been driving in basically minor league, I guess that's the right expression, NASCAR races around the world. And in fact, won a European race at the tender age of 17. And he has since been working his way up, winning races. And this year, an Israeli drove in the big leagues in Sonoma. It's been a year of that kind of pride. And in fact, we understand that just like this race car driver, Israel didn't get to where it is overnight and didn't get to where it is without a great deal of effort. In fact, we take special pride in the state of Israel, in its accomplishments, its industrial accomplishments, its military accomplishments, and its commercial endeavors. Many of us are enjoying Israeli wines of different types. But I am reminded now of a conversation with Yisrael Flam, after whom is named one of my favorite wineries in Israel, a gentleman who spent his whole life in the Israeli wine industry. And we're sitting tasting wines with Mr. Flam, a venerable elderly gentleman. And he said to us, look, the wines that we're making in Israel now are terrific. They're great. But if you want to be realistic, 2 estates near Tuscany produce more grapes than the entire state of Israel. As proud as he is of his product and of his family's product, the older gentleman understood things and I had a perspective on things, which was not sad, not frightening, but perhaps realistic. In addition to having our first big league NASCAR driver, this year the state of Israel has shown us more familial friction than we are accustomed to. For those who do not have degrees in anthropology, this is how familial friction works. If you walk down the street and you see somebody picking their nose, you really don't care. But if you walk down the street and see somebody you know, your child, your sibling, picking their nose, it bothers the heck out of you. Familial friction describes the phenomenon whereby we accept less misbehavior from our relatives than we accept from strangers. And certainly we, liberal Jews, political progressives, have been made uncomfortable, I'm trying to be polite, by some of the activities of the Israeli government, by the statements of officials of the Rabbanut, of the rabbinate in Israel, and of course by the blacklist, which I became aware of on June 9th. It was a Sunday afternoon. Because my wife is currently president of the Hebrew Free Loan Association, which in November will be honoring the Edelman family, and many of them are here, and we hope you'll join us. There was a brunch at our home, and unfortunately I had officiated a funeral that morning, and I got home as the party was unwinding, and just as I walked in the door, the phone rang. It was my son in Israel calling, and he says, Abba, did you hear about the blacklist? I said, blacklist? Not a blacklist. The chief rabbin had put out a blacklist of 160 rabbis around the world who are unacceptable in verifying people's Jewish identity. I said, okay, fine. I mean, what do I expect? I figured they said, well, the Reform rabbis, the Reconstructionist rabbis, the Conservative, okay, fine. He says, but there's all kinds of Orthodox rabbis on this list. I say, fine, it was a list of Orthodox rabbis who are currently out of favor with the political establishment in Israel, and then the Reconstructionist and the Conservative and the Reform rabbis as a group. And he says, See? Als klingelt auf der Emes. It's an old Yiddish expression that means a bell rings when you're telling the truth. And he says to me, Abba, you don't understand. He said, your name is on the list. As well as the Rabbi Michael Siegel, who signed my son's Aliyah papers back in Chicago. Actually, Michael, some of you may know, grew up here in Cleveland Heights. And a bunch of other rabbis' names. I said, what do you mean my name's on the list? He said, well, it's misspelled in Hebrew and in English, but it's you. We were joined on the list by Rabbi Yehoshua Fass. I don't know that many of you know Rabbi Fass. He's an Orthodox rabbi. He's one of the founders and the director of Nefesh B'Nefesh. That is the organization that worldwide is responsible for helping Jews make Aliyah to move to Israel. So we can talk about the technicalities of this list tomorrow during our sermon study time during services tomorrow, or if you like, on Yom Kippur during our study time. But suffice it to say that the rabbis who are on the list are the rabbis whose signatures and names arrived before the chief rabbinate in Israel, because this is a group of rabbis who encourage people to go to Israel, to long visits, extended study in Aliyah itself, because otherwise why do you need a letter from a diaspora rabbi? So no matter what kind of rabbi you are, including Orthodox ones, there's a list. And as I said, we can talk more about it. We see the deal for equal access or some access to the Western Wall, which is not very important to Israelis, but it's important to us, being scuttled. We see the Israeli government corrupt, more corrupt than it's ever been. We see the movements towards peace that we would prefer to see also being sidelined and sidetracked. It's a problem. It's a problem. How do we deal with this problem? We deal with it the same way Alon Day dealt with his first Major League NASCAR race. Which is to look at it not, I came out 32nd, starting 32nd in this one race, but to look at everything that's gone before, the successes and the challenges, the triumphs and the failures of years past. And that's how we should look at our relationship to Israel today, especially we who are in the liberal end of the Jewish community, both politically and religiously, even the right-wingers. Oh, both. So we start out where we started out in the Torah portion that we read this morning, with Abraham being told by God to head to a place that God will show him, to Har Moriah, a mountain of instruction, the mountain also called Zion. And that makes Abraham the first Zionist, because God promised him that there would be a home for the Jewish people there. But it took time. And Abraham knew it was going to be hundreds of years before his descendants would ever see that home. Moses, too, led his people out of Egypt, past and at Mount Sinai, and then for 40 you know what I mean, they wandered around in the wilderness for 40 years, and he didn't even get there with them. Jacob and Joseph were both deceased in Egypt and mummified in Egypt. But Jacob and Joseph both made their descendants and their families promise that when the time came, their remains would be returned to the land that their people would not yet occupy. And so after the destruction of the temple, the millennia that followed are tainted, painted, defined by our people's hunger to return to that land that even a Moses, a Jacob, and a Joseph could not go back to alive. Our great philosopher, Yehuda Halevi, talked about Israel as being the place in the world, the one nation, the one land that God's eye was upon all the time, having a kind of cosmic favored status. He and others talked about the fact that the earth, the soil itself, gave rise to a unique people. And for how many generations have we said, L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim? Next year, we will be in that city that grew up around Mount Zion. And so in some ways, we were all Zionists. And then there's the disappointments, the corruption, the peace process, the blacklist. Blacklist produced by a Rabbanut HaReshit, a chief rabbinate in Israel, whose immediate past Ashkenazi chief rabbi, Rabbi Yonah Metzger, is currently sitting in jail under a 3.5-year sentence plus about $1.5 million in fines for corruption, for taking bribes while he was chief rabbi. And the first set of crimes on the indictment were for bribery in connection with conversion. But they won't trust the conversion of rabbis, conservative, reform, reconstructionist rabbis who teach people, spend months with them, and take them to the mikveh with no remuneration whatsoever. In the past year, many of us have heard more and more people say, I don't know what it means to be a Zionist anymore. Yes, we understand that the term Zionist means someone who is in favor of a Jewish homeland in what used to be called Palestine, parts of which will be called Palestine again someday. But beyond that, given what we see, especially in the liberal community, how can we be Zionists? And I've had people say to me, Rabbi, I'm not a Zionist anymore. And we've seen a slippage of support for Israel, not just in the general community, but in the Jewish community as well, in our own congregation. Many people say that it's to be expected. The liberal wing of Judaism, conservative and Reform Jews, Reconstructionist Jews, they're the ones whose support for Israel was marginal to begin with, and we're not surprised. And there have been those Israeli officials, including cabinet members, who say that the support of the liberal Jewish community, or even the unaffiliated Jewish community, doesn't matter. But again, let's look at the long haul of the history, not just what's happened this year. If we really examine the long term, it was Orthodox Jews from a movement called Mizrahi who were the original anti-Zionists. Now they're Zionists more as much as anybody, but it used to be. And while there certainly were non-Zionist or even anti-Zionist elements within liberal Judaism, just as there are still today among some ultra-Orthodox Jews, that's hardly the whole story. Stan Blum is sitting here in front of me. Stan's family joined a new congregation called Temple Emanu in Texas because the Reform congregation that they had belonged to, and Stan's a couple of weeks older than I am, his parents moved to a different and a new Reform congregation called Emanu because in the congregation where they belonged, they were asked to sign an anti-Zionist pledge, that they could only be a member of that congregation if they were non-Zionists. So a whole group of people, including Stan's parents, walked out, started a new congregation. They met a Rabbi Alan Green, who served there temporarily, who eventually started a congregation by the same name here in the Cleveland area. So we come from part of the Reform movement that is, was, and always will be Zionist. Yet there's a challenge. There's a challenge. It is impossible to say that we who have supported the State of Israel through Federation and through AIPAC, through serving on Federation committees, through buying Israel bonds, through Jewish National Funds, walking, demonstrating, writing to members of Congress, it's impossible to say that we are not offended. It's impossible to say that we are not deeply, personally, spiritually hurt by the activities of the past few years. What do we do? Where do we go? We're at a crossroads. There's a couple of possible responses. We could take the example of Esau, who, when faced with a family feud between him and his brother, what did Esau do? He despised his birthright and he walked away. Or we could choose the path of Jacob, who's struggling to return to Israel from Aram, meets an Ish in the middle of the night at the ford of the river, and fights and struggles for his own piece of the action, and says, no matter what the opposition, we are part of the land of Israel. It is ours as well, whether we live there or not. Choosing the path of Esau, walking away, is easy, but it has a price. It has a price. Survey released just last week showed that in 2016 was the first uptick in anti-Semitism that we've seen in several decades around the world. We're not surprised. We all know that. We all read the news. There's an equation here. When Israel is perceived as weak, anti-Semitism goes up. When racial hatred and the kind of non-thinking that we talked about last night prevails, anti-Semitism goes up, Israel's prospects are diminished. We know that the world for Jews was very different before 1948, and we know that it was even different after 1967. But again, let's put things in perspective. On November 2nd, we will celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. And I say to you, only 100 years. Only 100 years. On November 29th, we will celebrate 70 years since the UN Resolution 181 that created the State of Israel, the partition plan. And next spring, we will celebrate Israel's 70th Independence Day. My friends, these are very small numbers. Very small numbers. If we think that Zionism began with Abraham, who lived, I don't know, somewhere between 4,000 and 10,000 years ago, If we think it began with King David, who ruled 1,000 years ago, 1,000 BCE, sorry. If we think about that and we look at our history, even though that we've been Zionists since Abraham, we have only had a unified state, a unified sovereignty for 80 years. 40 years that King David reigned, and 40 years King Solomon reigned, and after that, it broke up. In all these thousands of years, we have had a state for a continuous period of time, at most of 80 years. We are still 10 and a half years away from that record. Having our Jewish sovereignty is a rare, miraculous, fragile, ephemeral thing. How many of you are under the age of 75? Everybody here who's under the age of 75 does not remember a world without the state of Israel. In our minds, Israel is, was, and will be forever. But if we look at the long haul and we look at the big picture, this is a very fragile thing. It cannot afford too many enemies. It cannot afford to split up from within, as it did after King Solomon's reign. Can we walk away? Can we be Esau? Or are we commanded to be Jacob and fight within the family to preserve what we have? The world without Israel was, as Chaim Weizmann said, a world where Jews had no place they could stay and no place they could go. And while in the lifetimes of most of us, we have not seen the kind of anti-Semitism that we've seen before, we're seeing some pretty scary stuff. He has been fired from the White House, but for a while, a position in the West Wing was held by one Sebastian Lukash Gorka. Sebastian Lukash Gorka, one of the president's advisors, is a man who walks around wearing his late father's Nazi medals. Gorka is not a neo-Nazi, he's a regular Nazi. This is not a partisan speech. Remember intermarriage? My mother considered herself a Democrat. Look what's happening in the Democratic Party. Keith Ellison, the fact that he's a Muslim doesn't matter. Keith Ellison almost became the chairman of the Democratic Party. And he's a vice chairman or co-chairman, whatever they're calling him. This is a member of Congress who sometimes is the only member of the House who votes against Israel. This is a member of Congress whose history was one of supporting and praising Louis Farrakhan. Now let's think about that for a minute. Let's think about that for a minute. We are told that we're supposed to forgive his youthful indiscretions. On one hand. On the other hand, if you have a statue of Robert E. Lee, who's been dead for several years, you have to tear it down. Trust me, there's much more threat from a Keith Ellison who now denies his adherence to Louis Farrakhan's philosophy than there is from a bronze statue of a Confederate general who's long gestorben. Bernie Sanders, who appeals to many people, is a Jew in name only. He subscribes to a kind of isolationism that is not really different than the isolationism that we see from the right wing. And isolationism is not good for Israel. It's not good for Israel. And so if we break away, any of us, and trust me, I confess to you on this day of repentance that when all of these things were happening, and when you see your friends and colleagues' names showing up on a blacklist, there were moments when I questioned, why am I doing this? Why am I running to APAC meetings? Why am I running to Federation meetings? Why am I communicating with members of Congress? But at the end of the day, thinking about the long haul, thinking about the big arch of Jewish history, not just what's happened in the last couple of years, the answer is no. As offended, as alienated, as insulted as we may be, we're going to be Jacob. We're going to stick around and make the fight. And so we take the long view. We are Reformed Jews of a Zionist congregation, being led by Zionist clergy, being committed to the existence of a state of Israel, being committed to that vision that God first gave Abraham, and we continue marching forward, holding our place, not walking away, and knowing that eventually, we will see a state of Israel that represents all the wonderful things that we know, not that we believe, but that we know God intends it to. Shana Tova.